Welcome today to the Parenting at Mealtime and Playtime introduction and how to use PMP materials with families. We're so excited that you're able to join us today. As I mentioned, I will be recording the webinar and everyone will get a link to the recording. You will also get a link to the slides. You'll get a link to claim your CME credit and then also a resource that will help sort of guide you through the PMP materials because we have a lot of wonderful materials for you to use and share with families. So I wanted to also thank CareSource, who's sponsoring today's webinar. They've not influenced the content, but we do greatly appreciate their support to bring this education to you. And a couple of housekeeping items, as you may have noticed, everyone except for our presenters is on mute. That is to minimize background noise, just so we can have a clear presentation. But if we need to have any discussion, we certainly can unmute you. And also please use the chat box. We'd love to hear your comments, questions, items put in there. I'll be monitoring that and bringing that to the presenter's attention during the webinar today. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to the presenters to introduce themselves, and then we'll get started. So welcome, Dr. Adams and Sarah, and I'd like for you all, if you wouldn't mind, to introduce yourselves, and then we can get going.
Sarah, would you like to go first and then I can just take over? Yeah.
Yes. My name is Sarah Bidwell and I work for Ashtabula County Board of Developmental Disabilities, and I work in the Early Intervention Department in Ashtabula County. I am a service coordinator and a developmental specialist. And I am also a graduate of Kent State University. I got my master's in special education and I went through their early intervention program.
And I'm Sarah Adams. I'm a pediatrician at Akron Children's Hospital, and my office is in Hudson, Ohio. And I'm also the medical director of the Parenting at Mealtime and Playtime program. And we're really excited that that you've joined us today, because it's such an important topic, and we know nutrition plays such a significant role, and a lot of times we don't always have a lot of time with our families to go over it. So just kind of learning and understanding the resources can be so helpful. Next slide, please. So we have no disclosures, either of us, for this presentation. Next slide. So today we're going to summarize the importance of obesity prevention and intervention at an early age, and identify and utilize effective, what we call healthy weight messages, to encourage healthy habits, and help them develop these healthy habits for their families. Demonstrating the ability to communicate to families regarding sensitive topics. It's very sensitive when we talk about food or nutrition, because we know everybody's just trying to do the best they can. And how to utilize the Parenting at Mealtime and Playtime resources that have been developed by Ohio's pediatricians, developmental specialists like Sarah herself, and nutrition experts. Sarah didn't mention that she's also on our advisory board for for the PMP program, so thank you. So I'm going to go over, next slide please. I'm going to go over the resources more towards the end, but I think that this particular resource is one that it bears talking about twice, and that is that we have an app. Because we all know, we can print handouts, and our handouts are awesome. And sometimes people need something physical in their hand, but we also know that what do we always have in our hand, and that's our phone. So the mobile app, all the resources that we talk about today, they're also in the mobile app. And it's very easy to download, extremely easy to use for our families. Next slide, please. So today, what we're going to be talking about is why obesity is a concern. And there is that critical window, which is ages 0 to 5. And what are some public health messages, as I mentioned, that we focus on in PMP, and how caregivers have such a crucial role in this process, and how PMP can help you in your practice and working with the caregivers. Next slide. So we're all, we're all drawn to those chubby cheek toddlers and preschoolers and, but it's important to note that it isn't just being cute. The excess weight definitely has systemic effects, and we can't normalize obesity unless we address that fact. And in this slide, basically what you see is, how being obese, even at a young age, and then onto elementary school, adolescence, and even in adulthood, how it absolutely affects so many different parts of the body. Next slide. And obesity takes a toll on kids, not just physically, but mentally as well. So we know that they can develop psychosocial problems like depression and bullying. I just saw a girl in my office, bless her heart, she's 10 years old, and she, has a BMI that's over 95 percentile. And she says, like she's at that age now where some of the kids are literally just calling her fat, and it really makes her sad. But we also know long term that there are effects on children as they go into adulthood, like heart disease, diabetes, and we know that that's to be true. Next slide, please. So the Ohio Department of Health conducted a BMI screening of preschoolers between the age of 3 and 5 during 2016 to 2017. But I do have to tell you that the next few slides that I show you, even though, yeah, it was, several years ago, it really is, if anything, it's gotten worse, and especially since COVID. So what this study was, a randomized sample of 82 early childhood education centers and public preschool programs, and they were selected to yield this data. And they did it over 4 regions, and it involved about 3,000 children that were screened. Of course, we had consent from parents and so on, and it was all done by trained professionals. And what we acknowledged is that a little over 18%, this obesity prevalence was that little over 18% of 2 and 9-year-olds, are affecting more than like 13 million children and adolescents across the country, not just in our own little hometown. Next slide, please. And so this is showing by age, and that the problem starts early in life. And what you could see is healthy weight, so it's about a 1 in 3 if you kind of are doing the math. But they also looked at the disparities within age groups, but also within race and ethnicity. Next slide, please. So because of this increasing rate, of obesity, unhealthy eating habits, physical activity is, we may see the first generation that'll be less healthy and have a shorter life expectancy than what we have seen with their parents. And they're literally saying 5 times more than they're 5 times more likely to be obese as adults if they're obese in this early childhood area. So basically it affirms that children are growing out of weight, and it's harder, as they get older to kind of capture those healthy habits. So we have 5 reasons why early action, go ahead and next slide, please. We have 5 reasons why early action ages like that 0 to 5 is that critical period. And we call those the first 1,000 days. Next slide, please. So children are gaining weight in that first 1,000 days. And number 2, second reason that we need to really get a handle of this is obesity prevention interventions are focused between that 0 to 7, and it has been shown to be effective. So if we can get them in those early ages, we're gonna see some changes. Next slide. Number 3 is it's easier to build healthy habits in a child than to change bad habits as an adult. I think we can all attest to that. Next slide. I love this slide. And I actually use the clay analogy when I talk about a lot of different things when it comes to early childhood development. But we want to shape the clay while it's still wet. We have a super window of opportunity in these first 5 years, and even in the first 2 years. But we need to be patient. We need to tell our families to be patient, and it's just going to take time and patience, just as if you were working with clay. So one of the main concerns that we have when it comes to childhood obesity and those first 1000 days is caregivers are ignoring the fullness cues, and this can lead to unhealthy habits later, like overeating. So the key is telling parents to respond warmly to their baby's hunger and fullness cues. So what does that mean? What does that look like in a baby? Basically, well, the baby might stop and start feeding often. They might spit out or ignore the bottle, unlatch, close their mouth and turn their head, fidget or get distracted, or fall asleep. And so those are signs that basically the baby is full or getting full, and learning to respond to those cues. Basically, what we end up doing is healthy eating habits. They know when they're hungry and to stop when they're full. And it also places just a more comfortable and stronger bond within the family. And they also learn that mealtime can be fun, so that it doesn't have to be a struggle. Next slide, please. Now, toddler fullness cues can be things like they might shake their head, or say no more, all done, so I had this really darling family come in my office one day, and 18-month-old child, and they said, we just want to talk to you because he just keeps throwing his food on the floor. Well, we know that toddlers do that. So I asked a few more questions. I said, well, let me ask you this. I said, does he do it in the beginning of, like, when he starts eating, or do you notice that he does it like after he's been eating for a little while? And they're like, oh, it's always after he's been eating for a while. And I said, guess what? He's full. He's basically telling you that he is done. And then I also asked if there were any pets around, and sure enough, they have a pet. And so he likes feeding him too. So the idea of cleaning the plate just means that meal times become difficult. Kids become resentful. It's a power struggle, and it really doesn't need to be. And pressuring babies and toddlers to eat is going to have a negative outcome. It's going to lead to overeating. And, they're born with that innate ability to know when they're hungry and to stop when they're full. Next slide, please. So a healthy relationship is the infant initiates and guides the feeding interaction, and the caregiver responds early and appropriately to when they're hungry, when they're full, and they understand their developmental abilities around these feeding skills, and they balance the infant's need for help with encouragement of self-feeding. Now, as they get older, there's additional challenges developmentally. The toddlers in preschool, they have that fluctuating appetite. That food jag, which I think is such a funny old term. They're transitioning now to using utensils, and we need to make sure that they're having adequate vitamin intake and avoiding overconsumption of juice and sweetened beverages, so that we can develop healthy routines around healthy eating and activity. As they get a little bit older, the key issues is that we start to see the fallout of less fruits and vegetables. They're drinking less milk or things with calcium, vitamin D, of course, fiber. They're eating things that are more, that are less nutrient dense, and nutrient poor snacks, and they're drinking, overconsumption of those sugary foods, sugary beverages. And what that ultimately leads to is a lot of times an unhealthy body image, which is what I faced with that 10-year-old girl that I saw. Next slide, please. So the fourth reason is food preferences and levels of activity are really set by the time they're 2 to 3. So what do? Well, we need to build a healthy foundation when children are young and focus on the habits of the child and their family to create lifelong healthy behaviors. The literature that has been reviewed and offers key healthy habits for these kids and families that lead to healthy weights. And we can help distill these points with what we call 13 key health messages. Now, any ideas, and if you want to speak up, like any ideas what you think some of these health messages might be? You could enter them in the chat and I'll keep going. But, you could probably think of at least half of them before, we even present it. Go ahead, next slide. But some of these are kind of catchy too, like, water first for thirst. We can remember those things. Reduce screen time. Reduce screen time. 1 hour a day to play. Good rest is best. Make each plate a healthy plate. Take time for meals, cold weather fun, make breakfast count, make snacks count, build children up with words, growing great tasters. I tell my families a lot, look, if you change the language just a little bit, and instead of saying one more bite or two more bites, I heard a psychologist once say, no more 2-bite tangos, like 2 more bites, no, yes, just teach them to be tasters. And then instead of asking them, did you like it? You just say, how did that make you feel? So it kind of lowers that power struggle. And it kind of almost tricks them into like thinking like, I think they just tricked me into taking a bite, but you achieve the same things. Breastfeeding obviously is welcome. And then healthy celebrations. It's so funny. I can remember when even I was a little girl, you could bring cupcakes or cookies or, to school. And when it was your birthday, for example. So these are some examples, and don't be afraid to give them details. Like I said, so if you say healthy celebrations, maybe you make fruit kebabs or something like that and bring those to school instead of, cookies or cupcakes. We want to teach them to choose water to quench their thirst and not juice, sodas, and sugary foods. And, non-screen time to be creative, to be reflective, and sometimes we just need time to decompress. Next slide, please. So the 5th reason is that by early intervention, we can prevent lifelong health problems and raise the quality of life. Next slide. So PMP talks about these 13 messages, but has broader messages. And so the broader messages really come down into these 3 topics, which is literally the backbone: having an ideal diet, play, and a stimulating environment with a regular routine. So these strategies are what I call the 3 groups: nurturing and play, healthy eating, good nutrition, sleep, structure. And we're going to review some of that. But I want to note that we recognize that a lot of families in home visitings are really struggling with day-to-day life. So PMP is not intended to burden these families more, but rather to make life easier for these families. Next slide, please. Early on, we know that when the mother is, when we have the fetus, that malnutrition in the mother is already, before they're born, having an effect on the fetus. So what that is inadequate intake of calories and protein fails to ensure optimal growth of the developing embryo and the fetus. But studies have shown that it's not just nutrition, but other insults can play a role and really change the growth trajectory of the fetus. For example, decreased blood flow can have the same effect as not providing enough nutrients. The placenta is the lifeline that the baby's nutrition flows. So other insults may poison the cells of the body system, limiting developmental tissue and altering that organ function of the baby, and then sometimes permanently. Next slide, please. So I think this is such a really cool slide because there's something called the social brain, and it turns on right away at birth. And what I want you to note is that they're born with these cells, but they're not necessarily connected. And as they grow, even by 2 years, there's a lot of connections between those cells. So those are the brain cells. And so basically what's happening in those first 1000 days is we're wiring together the baby's brain cells. And so what's wonderful about that is that that's when we have the opportunity to really form those habits. Next slide, please. Serve and return is so important. And I know I'm getting away a little bit when it comes to nutrition, but again, remember, PMP is parenting in mealtime and playtime. So when a parent talks, sings, smiles, coos, it's not just baby talk, the baby reacts. And this will keep going back and forth through smiles, kicking their feet, and making their own sounds. And these simple moments make strong connections in the baby's brain. Next slide, please. So what makes this happen? This back and forth parenting style, because we know the baby's brain doubles in size by 1 year of age and triples by 3, this will be the ground floor for the baby's later thinking and learning. And it's an amazing growth. And it's in a one-time chance that the parents get to help wire these brain cells. So the most damaging thing for an infant's brain is to be ignored and neglected. Next slide, please. The brain is built from substances in our diet, vitamins, minerals, essential amino acids, etc. And I'm not going to read through all of this, but just to reiterate that it takes a lot of different components to build that brain. Next slide, please. We know that breast milk is the best source of nourishment in infants and children. And exclusive breastfeeding for the first 6 months is one of the most effective ways to ensure child health and even survival. So we want to encourage but we know that sometimes there are, like I said, these families are going day by day. I really try hard to be sensitive, to be understanding, to not push, to not, make our families feel guilty in any way if they're struggling with this. Next slide. So I'm going to, if there's any questions, please don't hesitate to put them in the chat. I'm going to turn over the presentation, but I'm going to be around too. And to Sarah, and we're going to talk about exactly what does playing mean.
So I also am going to be talking to you through the vision of a home visitor and how are you going to be able to help the family with this. So if we go to the next slide, play is really studying. So as a service provider in the home with the family, your primary role is to work and support the family in their child's life. And as a home visitor, you're going to be one of the first people face to face with the family in their home. And so you're going to be building that rapport with them, and you're going to be working towards helping them see that infants and toddlers are learning best through everyday experiences. And they're also learning best through familiar people and familiar environments. And that is all through play. We want the family to understand that with the necessary supports and resources, that they can be a big part of their children's learning and development. So as a home visitor, we can help families understand the importance through learning through play by sharing that play is part of the child's development, and that they're going to be using all those senses, touch, taste, smell, sight, and sound, to explore the world as they develop, and they can start to understand how things work. So for example, with infants, we're going to see them using their body to explore. They're going to be using their mouth to explore new textures and tastes. They're going to be starting to learn how to recognize, explore, and control objects. So we're going to see them shaking, banging, and throwing toys to try to learn the function of the toy. And then also how to start using their body. So turning their head, reaching their arm towards a toy. And then with toddlers, we're going to see new mobility. We're going to see them exploring their environment through crawling and walking. So they're going to be able to explore even more of that environment. We're going to see them exploring objects on how to control them. We're going to see greater fine and gross motor skills there. They're going to be developing skills to participate in language. And we also are going to see them starting to develop pretend play. Next slide. So mealtime is playtime, and mealtime is part of child development. And so as we talked about before, we're going to see a lot of sight, smell, taste, motor skills, all of that happening during mealtime. So we're going to see physical development, strengthening fine and gross motor skills, using those pincher grasps, gaining better control use of silverware, and also gaining independence. Your child's going to go from being fed to feeding themselves. Social skills, we're going to be, the child's going to be a part of family mealtime. They're going to be watching caregivers model eating. They're going to have that face-to-face interaction when you're offering them food or assistance. It's going to allow them to start communicating through gestures and words with you. And then also the opportunity to express their thoughts and their feelings. So Dr. Adams talked about encouraging your child to taste more than take a bite. And so even that reaction of that first taste is a way to communicate with the family. And then also we're going to see communication and language building where, again, it could be through gestures or words where maybe the child is saying more because they want more. And then as they grow, we can start to use more like 2 to 3 word phrases where we start saying more carrots. As they say more, we add that other word for them, and also allowing them to make requests at mealtime if they want more, or if they're all done, allowing them to be more independent to express that to you. Mealtime offers an opportunity for your child to watch and imitate interaction. So when a family strives to be together for a meal, they're going to be modeling eating skills, manners, and interaction. And this is going to help their child develop social and communication skills. So we also want to encourage a family to get into messy eating as part of their child's exploration at mealtime. So we want the family to understand that when the child engages in messy eating and they're feeling what a food feels like in their hand, it's also preparing them for what that food might feel like in their mouth. So as messy eating starts to help them build independence, and it allows them to explore food and utensils, and it helps them to be more confident as they start to build those skills. As a home visitor, I often hear families talk about how they don't like the cleanup of messy eating and they try to stay away from it. So these are points that we want to encourage them with. And then I also offer, maybe you don't do messy eating at every single meal. Maybe you have a certain meal like dinner time where once you're done with the messy eating, you can go right into your bedtime routine and that child can go and take a bath. So they've been able to explore the food and get messy, but then you already know that you're going to be giving them a bath after that time. We also want to talk about child-led. Dr. Adams talked a little bit about that, where we're allowing the child to communicate. And a lot of times that communication can be through gestures or words. And so being able as a home visitor to point out some of those gestures with the family. We also want to talk about the importance of repetition, introducing a food more than one time to the family. We want the child to become familiar. And so the first time that they try a food, they may not want to eat it because there are so many new experiences they have throughout that day. And so maybe at that moment, they were not interested in that food, but through repetition, we may find that they become used to it or they're willing to try. Next slide, please. So the benefits of play. So through play, children learn more about the world and how it works. So exploring inside and outside world with supervision is very important for toddlers' emotional, social, and physical development. So exploring allows children to use all of their senses, as well as working on those motor skills. Letting kids explore is one way that toddlers can also get their daily physical activity. As your child grows and starts to become more independent, you'll want to supervise their exploration, but you also want to step back a little bit and allow them some freedom and try not to intervene all the time as they're exploring. And we want to correct when necessary. So as your child explores and learns, they start to build confidence. And so try only to correct the child when it's absolutely necessary. So an example that I want to share with this is that my son is 3 and he is starting to learn how to read. And so he had the Brown Bear book and he's reading each page to me. And as he turns the page, he looks at me and he's just beaming because he's reading, and I'm smiling and reassuring him to keep going. And as he's reading the book, he's naming the wrong colors of the animal. And that could have been a time where I thought, oh, I'm going to correct him because he's not saying the right color. But what we want to recognize in that moment was that is not what was important. What was important is that social interaction, that confidence that he was building, those skills that he was using to show that he's reading, turning pages, interacting with me. And so I like to use this as an example when I'm with families to help them see the bigger picture, that sometimes it is important to correct. If we were working on colors, yes, that would have been a time for me to correct him, but that is not what our focus was at that moment. So just being able to recognize when is the right time to intervene and when is the right time to let your child continue to explore. Next, please. So this section is for fundamental motor skills. And so it's important to help families recognize that we don't always need fancy toys when it comes to working on these motor skills. Sometimes just our body, our space is exactly what we need. And through early intervention, oftentimes when we go in the home, we are working in the child's environment with what the family has right then and there. So sometimes just being in the living room and maybe reading a book that talks about active movement and then having the child run or jump or skip right there in the living room is just working on those motor skills. Next. So in this section, we're going to talk about building a healthy foundation, effective strategies, and healthy eating and eating environments. Next.
Sarah, I'm going to mention too, getting back to play, you can use things that are around the house very simply. I have a game that I play with my little nieces and they love it. And we use grocery bags and we put them as tails. And so we tuck them in the back of our pants and we play like animal tag. So we talk about it. So even they don't, you could use things that are commonly around, around the house to kind of build those fun kind of play activities. So, okay, keep going.
And something like that, taking a bag is pretend play, and it's using creativity, using your, the child's imagination. So you've taken something that's an everyday item in the house and you've turned it into being able to use their imagination. So when it comes to mealtime, in this section, we're going to be talking about how parents can really be involved with this. So obviously, when it comes to the family, they're going to be providing the food, they're going to be providing the environment that the child's in, but we also want to allow the child to be in charge of how much food they want, or how quickly they're going to be eating those foods. So we talked about this before a little bit, being able to recognize some of those cues. So if a child maybe isn't verbal yet, but Dr. Adams talked about them throwing food on the floor towards the end of the meal, it's their way of communicating with their family that I'm done. I don't want any more of this. And so being able to help families recognize how those gestures are ways of the child communicating with the family. Next, please. So how we learn to eat. So in early intervention, we use a coaching style in the home, and coaching is an interactive style that's hands-on for the caregiver. So it ensures that the service that we're providing and whatever we're doing or discussing is meaningful to the parents, and that it also is functional within their routines, what's important to them. So as a service provider, we want to build on what the parent's capacity is to support the child learning and development. So we want to be able to help them build on what they're already doing, and we want them to be able to do this when we are not there with them. So the parent-child feeding relationship is a perfect example of using this tool. So in order to establish healthy dietary patterns, we need to start with what practices are taking place now. So during the coaching process, I'm going to be asking things like, what is happening now? I want to get a picture of what it looks like at mealtime with the family and the child right now. As a service provider, I want to work with the family together to discuss, what do you feel is working for you? What do you feel is not working so well? And then let's talk about why. I also want to try new strategies with the child and with the family. I want to model that with the child for the family so that they can see what that looks like. And then I want them to be able to go ahead and take over and do that activity. I also always want to share with the family when I'm modeling something, why is this important? What is it that we're trying to achieve, so that they get a better understanding of what we're doing. I don't want to just do the activity. I want to make sure that the parent understands what we're gaining from doing it. And then I also want to make sure that I'm planning next steps with the family. So I like to take this time when I'm with the parent to say, how do you see yourself using this until the next time we're together? Or how do you see yourself using this throughout different routines or throughout your day? Next, please. So let's talk about repeated exposure. So as a service provider, a tool that I often use to help with repeated exposure is having talking points prior to a visit. So with talking points, it gives me the ability to be able, when a family is describing something to me, to be able to say, can you show me what that looks like? So that I can see exactly what that what that interaction is between the parent and the child. And then what we're able to do is build on those talking points. So we have that active parent and we have that participation. We're going to identify the family's activities, opportunities, and their routines. So that way we also can look at how could we use this in a different way? If I know their routines, then I know different ways strategy can be used. And then I want to try some of the practices that we're talking about. I want to practice together so that we can look at how it's working or maybe what needs to be changed. And then I also want parent reflection. I want to promote the child participation. I want to be able to focus on what they're doing together and pointing out to the parent, look at this interaction that you have together. The hope is that the family is going to continue these activities on their own when you're not with them. And there are some families that are very open to suggestions and they can't wait to get started. And then there are going to be some families who maybe you're questioning, are they doing these activities when I'm not there? So by doing these activities together when I'm in the home is actually starting some of that repetition. So if I'm doing that activity every time I go with them, the hope is they're going to build the confidence to then do it when I'm not there. Next. Association with food. So as a service provider, it's important to meet a family where they are at, not where you expect them to be. So we want families to recognize the importance of creating healthy eating habits and modeling these habits to their children. But as a service provider, you may have to help them recognize what supports and resources are needed for them to make that happen. So again, through that coaching style for interacting with parents, you're going to be able to help them recognize what they're already doing that works, that supports the child's learning and development. And then step by step, we can build upon what they're already doing with new ideas. So we're going to start with where they're at, and we're going to point out some of the things that they're already doing that we find really positive, and then we're slowly going to build on that. As Dr. Adams said before, sometimes we have to be really patient as we take those steps and build. We also want to reassure parents by pointing out positive steps that they've been taking, and then slowly adding those suggestions as they start to develop their skills with their child. Next. Picky eaters need stress-free eating. So in early intervention, family-centered practices, we outline ways of developing collaborative relationships with the families. And these practices include two key elements. That's relationship building, and then parent and family involvement. And so those used together increase the likelihood that the parent and the family are going to meet the outcomes that they've made. And it also means that they are more likely to work towards those outcomes when you are not there with them. So as a service provider, you'll get to know your family and their routines, and you're going to know what their strengths are, and you're going to know what their needs are. So part of reassurance is, again, pointing out the strengths that the family has and how they can use those strengths to work towards their goals. So here's an example. So a picky eater that you're working with, you're encouraging the family to introduce blueberries to that child each night at dinner. And the child has started to pick up blueberries and touch the blueberry and look at the blueberry, but is not yet eating the blueberry. And so the family's talking to you about, the goal is to eat them, and she's not eating them. But as a service provider, you can point out to the family that the child is doing something now that they weren't before. The child is making progress. Before, they wouldn't even touch that food, and now they're touching it, they're exploring it, and we just need to keep doing that repetition. And if they had stopped the first time that they offered blueberries and never offered them again, we wouldn't have been able to recognize that progress that's been made. So it's important to remind families that all progress is success. And we, as a home visitor, want to make sure that we're celebrating that and that they feel that success, because that is what is going to keep them going. Next.
I want to mention too, reassure parents that lots of exposures is a lot like if a parent is learning a new route that they're driving, or maybe an app that they're trying to navigate through. And so they're trying new methods or maybe new methods and ideas at work. And kids are just like that too about food. So a lot of times people say, well, they're picky eater, but really what they're expressing, what they're doing, how they're behaving is normal because they're learning to navigate through these new textures, these tastes, these smells. And so one of the ways to help that too is to pair something unfamiliar with something familiar, because they've already got that memory of something that they've had on a regular basis. That's why a lot of times you'll hear, well, my kid only eats chicken nuggets and French fries, because that's what they have now become familiar with.
So now we're going to talk about effective strategies, sleep, and daily routines next. So encouraging safe sleep. So the ABCs of safe sleep are alone, back, and crib. The safest place for your baby to sleep is in the room where you sleep, but not in your bed. And AAP recommends that infants share their parents' room for at least the first 6 months and optimally for the first year of life. Do you have anything you want to add, Dr. Adams?
The only thing I would add is, we're going to always, like, I saw a family yesterday and they're all living in like a basement apartment, for example. And so there's a toddler that's still sleeping in the room. And so we all know that there's going to be variations to that, and, being sensitive to it and understanding, because it was interesting when I was talking to them about this, because not only was the child sleeping still in the room after a year of age, but was in bed with the mom. And then she actually said the words to me, "I'm a terrible mother." But, they have a situation. So like Sarah said, taking what they have and seeing how you can work with that so that they don't feel like, have that guilt. But, and expressing the fact that, this is about safety, but not making them feel like, they're bad because their practice at the present time is this.
We'll go to the next one. Minimize stress with a structured day. So we know that children do really well with structure. And so this is just an idea of how a family might be able to structure their day. And again, as a home visitor, you may go into a home and you may recognize that a family does not have any structure in the home. And so that could be something that together you make a plan on that. And again, it might take time, and there may be only in the beginning, there may only be certain things that the family has structured, but the goal is to be able to have a full structured day for your child. Next. Sleep anchors and a daily routine. So this points out here the amount of sleep that children need at different ages. And you can see in some of the younger ages that it wouldn't always be that 12 to 16 hours total. It's together throughout their naps throughout the day. And again, this is part of that structure, starting to be able to create bedtime routines to help children be able to get the sleep that they need. Next. So enough sleep is critical. And so these are some of the things that we just want to point out, is that if a child's getting enough sleep, then they're going to have more attention throughout the day, and they're going to have more memory as they're learning and playing and exploring. And they're also going to have, all of those things, behavior, emotion, mental and physical health, all of those are affected by making sure that they have enough sleep. Next. So this slide is talking about 30 minutes before bedtime and working on creating a routine that is that quiet, slow down period. We want to look at not having the screens or the games or the rough play. And so we're going to talk about all of those different senses, like the lighting in the room and the music, and just being able to help the child calm down. And I often like to talk about with families creating that bedtime routine. What are some things that you can do in that 30 minutes to be able to meet these goals? And I also like to always talk about reading. Sometimes getting your child in the bed, having that light lower and reading some of those stories to them is a great way to slow it down. Next. Screens. So let's talk about limiting screen time. The reason that we want to talk about this is because when a child is watching a movie or educational program, they are experiencing someone else's make-believe world instead of using their own imagination. And so it's important to schedule that downtime and that free time that encourages creativity and, again, exploring their own environment. So pretend play and simple non-electronic toys, they require that creativity, that imagination, and social interaction. Next. So play, indoor and outdoor. So games, physical activity, creative play, make-believe. These are all things that we're going to be talking about in this area. Next. So we touched on this a little bit about, but I did want to just talk about, well, let's just go to the next slide because it does go with this. So we want to think habits, not exercise. And so I am going to give you just a couple tips on some ways, some things that you might be able to do that helps using your body in your environment a little bit more than those toys. So the first thing is emphasize active transport. So this is walking to school, walking to grandma's house, even walking to the mailbox back, with your child. The next one is promote play. So we want to talk about gross motor skill development and how it can happen in the home. You don't need to always have, a special class or even a physical therapist to do some of those motor activities. So, and these activities can take place inside or outside. So for example, I talked about this before, if you're reading a book and it has active words in it, you can have your child, when you say jump or clap, have them physically do some of those activities. Pretend play, being animals. So you're crawling and you're roaring. We all know this song or the story, Going on a Bear Hunt. So let's pretend that we're really going on a bear hunt. And you can do that inside or outside. Engage in sensory education with play. I love sensory education because, again, you do not need toys to do this. You can explore your yard and you can talk and look at leaves and the flower and rocks. Let your child feel the different textures. Let your child talk about the different textures. Environmental sounds when you're outside, the birds chirping, a car beeping its horn. If your child's younger and they're starting to, they're not talking yet and they're starting to become vocal, those are great sounds to make and they're able to imitate those sounds with you. Finger paints, and of course, messy eating can be part of sensory education. And then active living is a learned skill and parents are the best teachers. All these activities that I just talked about are great activities for parents to model and do with their children. Next. How do we inspire parents to adopt these effective strategies? So Trust and respect are the cornerstone of a service provider's relationship with a family. And that develops because two people are working together towards that achieved family goal. A family is more invested and more likely to implement new strategies if they have been part of the plan and they understand that it's supporting their family. In early intervention, the family is part of the planning process. And so if the family has an opportunity to share what is important to them and they're able to be part of creating the goal, then they're more likely to put forth the effort to reach that goal. Dr. Adams talked about when she was with that family in their environment and the mom expressed how she felt. That is an opportunity for you as a home visitor to be able to say, I hear what you're saying, and I think that this is an opportunity for us to work on this. This could be something that we could work together and we could find some supports and resources that would help you. So when you're helping to support a family, be aware of the family's perspective. You do not want to go in with your own thoughts on how things should be. You need to be aware of how the family is seeing things, and you need to seek to understand their concerns and their priorities. You want to develop and use effective listening skills, because there's going to be things the parents say to you that are going to be part of you gathering the information that you need to help the family. Show sincere concerns and empathy for the parents' struggles, because that is where they are at. And we have to meet them where they're at to help them. And then let's acknowledge the family's strengths and accomplishments. So when that mom was concerned about her environment, we also were able to note that her family was together, that it was an interactive environment. There are positives from that environment. Let's help her see those so that we can move forward. Using these tools will help you to be responsive to the family circumstances, and it's also going to help you build a relationship with them. And these tools can be used to inspire family participation. So involvement with the family means that the parents are actively engaged and that they are obtaining the supports and resources that they need to achieve those goals. Next. So think habits, not diet. So we want to emphasize the whole food pattern rather than single nutrients. And we want to promote responsive feeding strategies. So we talked about this before. Recognizing what your child's communicating and being open to what those communications are. And then I also want to talk about in this section that I have used the My Play icon to create activities with the family. And so what I've done is when I go into a home, I always want to use what the family has. Or if I take something with me, I'm going to leave it with them because I want them to be using it when I'm not there. So I've used the My Play icon, which has colors that teaches the child, what different foods should go on their plate. And then I've created pictures of some of those different foods and I've color coded them. But when I'm doing that activity with the parent and the child, if I'm in a situation where the family is struggling on what is a healthy habit, I may be teaching the family as the parent as well as the child. And it's an activity that everyone is learning from, and it's an activity that they're doing together. So as a home visitor, think about how can I teach the child, but maybe also how can I also bring in some of that education for the parents in a in a way that doesn't make them feel like I'm trying to tell them something that they don't know.
I just wanted to mention we have a couple minutes left, so I know we're getting a little short on time, and just wanted to kind of give you a heads up about that if there's any slides more toward the end that you all wanted to cover.
Dr. Adams, do you want at this point for us to just kind of go through these together a little bit quickly?
Sure,
Okay.
sure. I think the rest, I mean, I and you, thank you for going. I mean, I really, and I learned some things too. So I really appreciate the strategies that you have given, because you know, a lot of times we just talk about this is what you need to do, this is what you need to you know, teach them, but it's the how, and getting them to be on board is so important. The next couple slides, like meal planning, for example, if you could advance to that slide. And like we actually have on the in PMP a we actually have these sheets that you can give out, and it's
Mhm.
really cool because it has examples and some ideas for them to be able to do this. And I don't think we have it on one of our slides, but we also have activity sheets that they can like track their activity as well. Next slide, please.
And I just want to point out
Here's
too
the
that with those sheets as a home visitor, they're great talking points to be able to go over with the family. So they have that visual, but then they also have you to go over and ask questions. So these sheets, I've used them in the home and they're wonderful, especially when it comes to what can I expect from my child at this age. And by using these the PMP toolkit, you'll be able to go over that with the family.
I agree. I'm a visual learner, and so you know, and I know some people, a lot of people are. So it's a great, like the next slide is the dietary guidelines, and that's example of the My Plate. So even if you don't have the My Plate, if you have a just a simple paper plate, and you could show them how half of the plate should be fruits and vegetables, grains, proteins, and dairy, because I hear a lot in my practice, well, he doesn't eat much protein. Like a serving doesn't really have to be a lot, you know, and reassuring them that actually what they are doing is really good. Next slide. And so this is just a great example of, you know, what that nutrient, those nutrient dense, you know, suggestions can be. And a lot of times I'll say, eat the rainbow, you know, because it has so much to offer there. Next slide. This is a resource too that we can offer to families about sweetened drinks. And remember that one slogan that I mentioned, water first, water first for thirst, and say that 10 times fast. And we did this in my family when my boys were growing up, is we had milk at meals. And it's kind of funny because sometimes I'll go out to dinner with my adult children now and they still order milk, which I think is kind of cute. Next slide, please. And this slide again just reiterates how back to that study that they did, and how these kids, you know, and the ratio of the kids that are really drinking quite a bit of sugary beverages. Next slide. Because we know that milk is critical for growth. Next slide. I'm kind of flying through these. We have great handouts too about healthy meals and snacks, but also keep in mind is that dietary patterns are personal. We have to also be acknowledge that there's preferences, there's cultural differences. And so improvements can be gradual. I always try to, you know, like think about what are one or two changes that we can make, that, and how likely do you think you'll be able to do that, or how does that sound to you? And because a lot of times if we try to change everything, it's we're just setting them up for failure, and you know, we're not going to see the long-term changes if we do it that way. Next slide is shows a really great, like making mealtime stress-free, eating together without screens. And next slide. Again, behavior change is gradual, you know, so it's acknowledge that they're acknowledge the things that they're doing and that it's all right. Next slide. So we've already mentioned some of the handouts, but you know, we've got our webinars, the app. Next slide. And this is how you can access through our Ohio AEP website gain these handouts. Next slide. And so these are some examples, you know, how Sarah was mentioning, like, well, what can I expect developmentally? And there's handouts to show them, you know, what they should be doing developmentally, eating, activity, and they're colorful, they're easy, you know, to read, and really are kind of fun. Next slide. And again, starting solids. We were talking about responsive, you know, feeding and recognizing hunger and fullness cues and play. And we've got handouts for all of these things. Next slide. But we also want to acknowledge that we do know that food, that sometimes, you know, it's easy to say, eat those fruits, vegetables, but if they don't have access, we want them to know that we also have resources for food assistance. Next slide. Again, meal planning. Next slide. And we have now extended our PMP to also include older age groups. So things like cooking together, eating the rainbow is the one handout. And as they get older, what's really fun is one side of the handout is for the parents, the other side is for the kids. And we also are now converting our resources into different languages. Next slide. And so there's that app again. Like I said, bears repeating. We know they've got their phone. It's a great resource. It sends reminders, which is super cool, notifications if they sign up for it. And then this is, we have a toolkit, just tons of information. So I highly recommend registering for the toolkit. It's all electronic, it's easy to use, and just to kind of build on what we've already discussed today. But I want to just emphasize, and I'll let Sarah mention anything else too, but just kind of going over some of the key points, and that is, you know, this is child-led feeding. We provide and the child decides. You know, serve and return talking, so important, so that all of those little synapses that I mentioned in that brain, it's no wonder the brain triples, you know, by the time they're 3. And then reading, screens, playtime, so important, but structuring meals, snacks, you know, structuring meals and their snacks so that when they come to dinner, they show up hungry instead of just grazing all day. And then having that routine for bedtime and a routine and making sure they get enough sleep, because we know sleep, not only can we know that there's an association with obesity if they're not getting enough sleep, but that neurocognitive development too. And bottom line is we want to help parents develop their skills, these skills, to ensure the child has healthy habits. Next slide. Anything else you want to add to that, Sarah? I know I flew through the end of that, but
no, that was great. That was great. I just want to share that with the content from the PMP toolkit, that when children are going to see their pediatrician, a lot of the different things that the pediatricians are going over with the family are in that. And so as a home visitor, if families have questions over some of those milestones or some of those different things that they've talked about, that is an opportunity for you as a home visitor to be able to kind of continue with the work that the pediatrician started. So when they're in the office and they're, you know, talking about these different things, as a home visitor, you can continue that work in the home with them.
All right. Well, thank you all so much. Appreciate that. Was just wonderful content and such great, helpful tips. I put in the chat box just a reminder that early next week, everyone will receive an email with all the slides, resources, a link to the recording of this webinar, and a link to claim your CME credit. Please don't ever hesitate if you need resources or have additional questions. You can email me. I'll put my email address in the chat box, and I am happy to try to get resources in your hand or get someone who can answer any questions or be helpful in any way. And we thank you again, and thank you very much, Dr. Adams and Sarah, for a wonderful presentation today.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.